Oh, well, hello there. Welcome back to Introduction to Cultural Anthropology. Today, we're going to be talking about race and racism. We'll take a look at sort of the historical context, certainly through the sort of Western gaze when it comes to race, and then how it's led to enacting racism. What does that look like? And how do we see that? A lot of this stuff we might already be somewhat familiar with, but we're going to kind of try and break it down a little bit and have a better historical context to look at this, and then that'll help us to understand the mechanisms that are either continuing or perpetuating or dealing with uh, our various issues with race and racism. Okay, so that's start this process here. So what is race? How do we define it? When we think about it in a biological sense, we are essentially one species, right? We're the human race. There is very, very little difference between what we consider to be the different races, right? And it's important to recognize the fact that genetically we're, for the most part, very, 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 very similar to each other. Um, but there are differences, and those differences, um, took in some cases hundreds of thousands of years, if not millions of years, to actually develop. But it has very little to do with our capability as a species to think and to do the things that humans do, right? Now, for centuries now, we have been looking for the things that define us and in many ways separate us, especially if we consider um, like the concept of social Darwinism, in which early anthropologists and other social scientists uh, tried to connect the biological evolution of a community to their cultural evolution, right? And oftentimes it was a means to um, denigrate a community because they lived what at the time they thought was a primitive lifestyle. And through our own modern look at different races, we have realized that those other cultures, even if they weren't as technologically advanced, were still perfectly suited for their environment and had gotten that way socially um, to be suitable to live there, right? They didn't have to have all the technology and extra stuff that other societies had. Western culture, some Eastern cultures, um, Indian cultures that had developed different levels of technology, different levels of so-called civilization. But a lot of people wanted to create those distinctions. And so many years, scientists had oftentimes focused on those things. So over the years, we have, as we've developed more knowledge, more understanding of biology, taken a look at culture itself, and really changed how we approach it, we've come to realize that those differences aren't there, right? And this is something that has been taught to us. This is something that has been enculturated into our daily lives, into our culture. Those beliefs that we are different stem from us continually reinforcing those ideals, right? The stories that are told, the sort of the propagation, the education, the religion, anything that creates those differences is done culturally. It really has nothing to do with the biological, although we have oftentimes looked for it. Um, when we look at sort of just some of the biology of this, if we look at genotype and phenotype, genotype refers to the physicalized genetic data that is passed from parent to child. Phenotype is how that gene is expressed. Okay, so you might have genes from multiple people, but it gets expressed in certain ways, whatever those sometimes dominant or sometimes recessive genes might get expressed. And that can be everything from skin color to eye color to height to overall health. A lot of those things can be impacted by how those phenotypes are ultimately expressed. Um, as in, we have kind of we haven't really talked about the evolution of the human species, but within anthropology, the theory and theory is very, very strong and has a ton of evidence to support it, is that we came from Africa as a species. We developed in Africa along with many of the other great apes. And then as we developed there to become more or less our modern human species, we started immigrating to other parts of the world. And as we did that, we adapted to new conditions, right? New environmental conditions, gaining either lighter skin or whatever, right? To deal with some of the environmental issues. So, right, as we moved about, it didn't change our capability, it didn't change our intelligence. It just allowed us to adapt more easily to that environment. So we see that this way of looking at race a lot of times based on that geographical location. For Western cultures, we oftentimes associate race with skin color. There are cultures around the world. We might even look at the Hutus and the Tutsis of Rwanda. And they would see race as a difference in height instead of skin color, and their skin colors are dark. There wasn't a way to sort of distinguish, right, between the two groups. So it ended up being based on height. And so that's just how they categorized the differences, right? And that's really what race is all about. It's how we categorize things, right? Human species is oftentimes looking for those means to categorize. If we look at the process of colonization, because we'll be focusing more on sort of Western colonization during this lecture, we look at the fact that in the 1400s, as technology in Europe began to grow and they started being able to have larger fleets of ships capable of sailing around the world with explorers looking for, and we can look at Columbus as being one of those. They were looking for trade routes. They were looking for ways of commerce. And this really had a huge impact on what we see as the modern world today. Was this looking at colonization of centralizing power structures. A lot of this was based on the economic, political, and military capabilities of Western Europe and what they were trying to accomplish. So we start seeing through that Western gaze the differences in races, right? Creating sort of ideologies around that. Now, if we even go back then and look at the concept of race, it doesn't even match what we have today as far as like certain concepts of race. And we'll talk about that in a minute. After World War II, we actually see a huge shift in that sort of traditional look at race and how racism was conducted. World War II was interesting because it really changed sort of the West look at the control of different countries, right? They had colonial powers. A lot of what Europe had as far as colonies throughout Africa was released. There were many countries that had been in control by the French or the British or the Spanish, the Germans, all had colonies around the world and used that as a power base, oftentimes for trade. They would use those resources in those countries, send those riches back to Europe, sometimes in the means of, actual products, food, spices, textiles, stuff like that. And then also in human trafficking, right? Slavery. Even the United States had a number of different colonies at that time. Around the turn of the century, the 19th century, we had control, 19th to 20th century, we had control of a number of islands and nation states. For example, even like the Philippines. The Philippines at one point was a part of the United States, which is kind of a long story as to how we got the Philippines from the Spanish-American War. We captured them and then held on to them for a number of years, eventually releasing them. Then we also had places like Puerto Rico, Cuba for a small amount of time. We also have, of course, American Samoa, Guam, right? We have these little islands that are still a part of American colonialism, to the point now where those independent little places, right? They're a part of the United States, but they don't have the same equal rights as the rest of Americans. They don't have the same voting capability. They don't have the same representation, even though technically they are Americans, right? And that's one of the reasons why we've talked about in the past, especially in politics lately, Puerto Rico becoming possibly like the 51st state, because they are Americans, right? But they just don't have the same representation. Something to think about in the future when we look at how these different, how we look at colonialism and how that still has an impact on the United States today. But World War II happened. We see a lot of those colonial states being either returned or released, and a lot of those lines becoming redrawn, those borders being redrawn into many of the states that we see today, or many of the countries that we see this today. How do we see race today? Okay, now this is something that we all deal with every day, but we don't always see it sort of up front, right? But it starts at birth, right? When we get our birth certificate, okay? That's the first time that we experience the concept of race, right? We create these boxes in which we have to fit. We get categorized. We have to get counted. And to do that, right, the first place where we see that is our birth certificate. Then we see it in schools. We see it in our churches. We see it in job applications, right? Every time you have to fill out a job application, you have to fill in what is your race, right? When you decided to go to school, one of the things that you were asked was, what is your race? If we were a truly um, equalized government, meritocracy type country, we wouldn't have those kinds of boxes to fill, right? We wouldn't have those categorizations because everyone would be treated equally. We still have those things that tie us to that categorization of what is race and how do we deal with that race. So we'll take a look at that real quick about how the federal government has looked at race um, throughout the last 150, 170 years. So if we go back in time, if we look at the 1850 census, right, there were really just three classifications. These were the three classifications that the federal government was interested in counting, right? Whether or not you were white, whether or not you were black, or whether or not you were mulatto, right, being of mixed race. And the reason was is because there were white landowners. They were the voters. They were the only ones that were really voting. You had black slaves, right? This is still during the time of slavery. Slavery had been going on for up to this point close to 300 years, 400 years, that the United States had been sort of exposed to slavery. And then mulatto, right? And that was basically everybody else, right? Then in the 1870s, that changed from three classifications to five classifications. We have white, black, mulatto, Chinese, Chinese being becoming more and more of an influence, especially along the Pacific coast. There was a growing Chinese population. That Chinese population was being used oftentimes as laborers. And so they were coming in great numbers, and especially after the Civil War, as a lot of African Americans left the South, there was a lot of work that was opening up. And so a lot of Chinese moved into that area. Then you have in the 1940s, we have new classifications: white, Negro, Indian, Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, Filipino being the fact that the Philippines were a part of the United States and actually had a large population, which was being counted, not necessarily equally, but was being counted. Hindu, right, and that's Indian, but is really looking at sort of the religion. They had to create some sort of a distinction. And then Korean, and there were more and more Koreans that were coming over along with Japanese and Chinese. And so that was how we classified people in this country at that time. If we look at, say, the 2010 census, this gives us a much more sort of diversified look at how we see people, right? How the United States government sees people. And this has been changed even not that long ago when the Trump administration was conducting the 2020 census. There was questions about how the census should be done, right? Who should be counted, right? And that's an interesting question as to who should be counted, because the census deals specifically with how not only where people live, but how money gets distributed. If you are living in a community of a community that has a large number of immigrants in it, but you don't count immigrants, which was part of what the administration was trying to do at the time, then there would be less funding going to that community. And that could obviously have an impact on that community. So let's take a look at this census and see how it's distributed, right? So the two big things here is that now there's sort of an introduction of two main categories, right? Whether or not you're Hispanic or Latino, or not Hispanic or Latino. Okay, and this is more about ethnicity and not necessarily about race, because you might see yourself as being Hispanic or Latino, but racially you would see yourself as being white or African American, right? So now we're actually seeing a connection between race and culture, right? And because of our connection to Central and South America and how many immigrants and migrants we see, this becomes more and more, excuse me, of a question. So culturally, how do you see yourself? Hispanic or Latino, or not Hispanic or Latino? So they break it down, right? We see in Hispanic or Latino communities, 16 million, almost 17 million people see themselves as white. About 3/4 see themselves as black or African American. Um, Native American or Native Alaskan, right? We see as 400,000. Um, and so we're seeing how this breakdown works, both culturally and racially. Um, and then we see like the non-Hispanic or Latino, um, and how that breaks down into different categories. And so we start to see that we're creating more and more spaces for representation, right? Instead of looking at all Native Americans together, which had been done when we had, well, taken Hawaii and then made it a state, thinking about them as sort of like Native Americans, but they're really part of a different culture group, right? They're part of the Pacific Islander community, so Oceania, right? And that connects them to other places that we have, Guam and American Samoa. So we have these other locations, right? So they end up breaking that up into, again, more subgroups. And then we also engage in, do you um, represent two or more races? And then how do we sort of fit that into that conversation? So the federal government has certainly expanded the way that it recognizes individuals, but what would we do differently today if we were to redesign the census, right? How would we look at race in a new light? And I think that's an important question for us to ask. And it's an important thing to look at when you go to another culture, when you go to another country. How do they view the differences between the people that live there? Um, so yeah, kind of important to think. Something that you don't see on here is any sort of reference to, um, uh, with the exception of some other, right? Looking at Arab, right? If you're coming from the Middle East somewhere, right? And so that becomes, again, othering, right? Who do you fit in with? And that also helps to sort of cement sometimes your ideas of how you fit into society. When you are classified as other, how does that have an emotional impact on you? How does that have that cultural impact on you? How does that make you feel a part of a community or separated from a community? So we want to try and understand those differences and how it might impact people and their sense of identity. Okay, we're going to stop here and then we'll continue on in a few moments with the next segment. All right, we'll see you in a few.